Yeah, just checking if this is audible.
Yes, it is.
Okay, starting my speech in three, two, one. Let's go. And I think a few things in my speech. Firstly, what are the interests of the EU and what the EU currently looks like? I think it's fairly intuitive in terms of like what the EU looks like economically and politically. The European Union consists of like vastly advanced economies that become significantly relative important later. Secondly, politically, the European Union as a whole largely espouses human rights and like condemns human rights violations across the world and has been largely viewed as like a bastion of human rights and promoter of human rights across the world. These two interests necessarily are undeniably damage the point in time we lift sanctions against the Taliban regime. But I just like to note here to the extent as to what they when they talk about sanctions, I don't think the European Union sanctions are like just lax sanctions. I think they're in most of the sanctions against the Taliban are targeted sanctions in the form of asset freezes against like top Taliban officials and top military commanders within the Taliban to the extent that the amount of damage they cause to Afghan civilians on the ground is relatively limited. This is clearly evidenced by the fact that the European Union still funds a lot of humanitarian aid via the International Red Cross and organizations as such which work on the ground in order to ensure that the lives of Afghan civilians are not put completely in the toilet. We just don't want to ensure that the Taliban government and the Taliban military commanders have a lot more money to crack down on their own civilians, right? But first, let's also talk about the Taliban regime and what sort of actions they've been conducting on the ground, but also trigger warning to the extent that the Taliban has not only engaged in massive human rights violations on a scale which has been like literally unheard of, to the extent where they've shut down schools, they've executed a large number of human rights activists, women's rights activists have been killed, LGBTQ activists have been killed, minority communities have been summarily executed, and so on. But even apart from this, they've gone on to support other armed groups within the Middle East and North African region, within India, in that they've supported the Indian Mujahideen, and they've also pledged support to the Chechen rebels in Russia, and so on and so forth. We think to that extent, even if we are likely to lift sanctions, it in the fact that the Taliban espouses a greatly anti-Western sentiment, if we are likely to lift sanctions, I think it's incredibly unlikely that it's going to suddenly pivot towards the West and become extremely friendly to the West to the extent that they have absolutely no incentive, even if we lift the sanctions against us, to cooperate. So we think that I don't think they've proven cooperation on their side either. But the point in time, cooperation is significantly likelier to happen in that the EU's ability to negotiate with the Taliban government in order for them to give some concessions to civilians on the ground, in order to scale back offensive attacks against the civilians on the ground, is likelier to happen. The point in time, the European Union has a bargaining chip in the form of sanctions against the Taliban government as a whole, and is able to dry out the resources of the Taliban government from not only attacking their civilians more and more, but also is able to like negotiate concessions for their civilians. To that extent, I think the economic loss to the European Union, the trade-off, is relatively limited to the extent that, for one, European Union countries are in the vast majority significantly richer, and the amount of trade deal or damage to their economies due to the sanctions placed on Afghanistan is extremely limited. So to that extent, we think that the loss to the European Union is like fairly limited. But also secondarily, if a concern is going to be pivoting, like the Taliban government pivoting towards other countries, we think that is also incredibly unlikely to the extent that the Taliban has pledged support to non-state armed groups in Chechnya, which has significantly pissed off the Russian government. They have pledged support to Uyghur rebels in China as well. In the point in time the European Union rolls back sanctions on the Taliban, it is likely that Taliban is likely to not only fund these groups, which they have pledged support to in the past, but also likely to attempt to at least send fighters or at least pledge some sort of support to these groups, which they have already done in the past. This not only pisses off two large actors to a massive extent, but also destabilizes the region and destabilizes other allies in this region, such as India and such as like other North African nations, which necessarily Middle East and North African nations, which the Taliban has already pledged to support in the past. The point in The point in time we do this, the interests of the EU and the interests of our allies are significantly more damaged. But quickly engaging with their idea about the EU refugee crisis and the fracturing within the EU. Firstly, I think most of the refugees are coming into the European Union was from Syria. The number of refugees in status quo coming into the European Union from Afghanistan is fairly limited, to the extent that Afghanistan is very far away from the European Union. It's not just crossing the sea, unlike in the case of Syria, but also to the extent that Taliban has locked down borders, as well as the surrounding nations surrounding Afghanistan have locked down borders. Thus, the amount of refugees able to escape is fairly limited. So I'm unsure as to how such a massive refugee influx is happening. And furthermore, I think what their fracturing happens to a significantly higher degree is the point in time the EU rolls back sanctions against the Taliban government. Because note, pan, the right-wing governments, as they point out, like within the EU, like Austria, Belarus, or France, or like somewhat more, slightly more conservative leaning, are significantly like to opt out, and in the vast majority of cases, likely to lose their minds. The point in time we are seen as endorsing the Taliban by rolling back sanctions against them and being viewed as attempt to at least establish some level of cooperation. This is likely to piss off these countries significantly more than in their world. But even further, I think the significantly more liberal nations within the European Union, whose electorates and whose civilians necessarily care about things like human rights on the ground and who value human rights, are likely to view the European Union as a union which is now endorsing a government which is actively en masse violating the human rights of its civilians. So I think fracturing happens significantly more in Gov's world as opposed to negative world. In the point in time, countries on both sides of the aisle within the European Union view the European Union as an illegitimate actor, which is now allowing for a government, allowing or endorsing the Taliban government. But furthermore, I think in terms of optics and signaling, I think it signals to other conflicts across the world and armed state groups across the world that if they capture territory, the European Union will just kind of like bow down and like allow the and legitimize them, to the extent that we're completely fine with an armed group which has like slaughtered civilians and destroyed human rights, that the European Union will just now bow down and trade with them. I think to this extent, the EU is not only viewed as endorsing the Taliban government, but also legitimizing it to a large extent, which is necessarily problematic, because to the extent where the European Union is also involved in conflicts across, is involved in conflicts or is allied with nations which are embattled in conflicts against non-state groups, not only in Africa, in the Middle East, and Latin America as well. These governments are likely to be significantly more skeptical of the European Union as a partner, because they now see the European Union as, oh, it's probably a union which is likely to just pivot towards the enemy if they ever capture enough territory. We also think, furthermore, the Taliban having more money not only is able to support other armed groups in the region and destabilize them significantly further, in the form like they support the Indian Mujahideen, which they've already started, which is likely to destabilize the region and lead to a significantly larger refugee crisis, and also damage our allies to the extent that there is a larger number of armed groups or mercenaries floating around, creating significantly higher amount of instability within the region, because they have already pledged allegiances to them in the past. We also think, furthermore, civilians in Afghanistan and the fact that the Taliban now has more resources by virtue of the fact that we have rolled back sanctions, has an increased ability to crack down on its own civilians and continue its policies by which they summarily execute civilians, human rights activists, and so on, and like further detract away from the rights of minorities. We also think then it is additionally cumulatively adds to the fact that they feel even more betrayed by the West, to the extent that not only did we prematurely roll back military presence, which allowed the Taliban to take over in the first place, but are now seen as actively endorsing the Taliban government by rolling back sanctions. We think this greatly damages the image of the European Union, to the extent as being viewed as purveyors of human rights to that extent. We think that if the metric at all within this debate is to ensure that the Taliban government is at least faced with a massive amount of pressure, or even is weakened to the extent that they're either able to be weakened or taken down, that is at least likelier to happen in our world versus in their world. Because we don't think the Taliban government, or there is any evidence to show that the Taliban government is one which is nice or is likely to care about the civilians of Afghanistan, if you ever look at the newspapers. For those reasons, negate.
I thank the first negative speaker and welcome the second affirmative speaker.
Great. Can you hear me? Just to
Yeah.
check.
Do you still consent, by the way?
Oh yeah, I still do.
Okay,
Just give me a couple of seconds to set up my debate timer, if that's okay.
no problem.
I'll be beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. No one is denying the fact that the EU is a pro-human rights union. No one is denying the fact that the EU wants what's best for itself and what's best for its people. But we already told you that this is the way to lessen those human rights violations. We need to talk about how are we likely to improve and change the rights and improve human rights within terms of like the situation in Afghanistan, within terms of the Taliban regime. I think it's simple. Will sanctions ultimately work, or will sanctions ultimately not work? I think the only reason on why things such as like rights for women were suddenly improved is when the Taliban noticed things such as like the US making trade deals with them within terms of like conditions in order to improve those rights, which means that the Taliban also notices that there is external pressure that they cannot back down on. And sanctions aren't the way to do this. They are more amicable to you when you listen to them and you give something that is tit for tat at the end of the day, which means at the end of the day, the US is likely, which means like things such as like the US trade deal with them is ultimately what leads towards their benefits, which means that the Taliban can and will listen to you if you are giving something in return. What they want is for the betterment of them. What they want is for the betterment of their people, and what they want is ultimately for the better is ultimately something in exchange at the end of the day. The next thing that you have to note, and this biggest thing that comes from side negative, is that will this become a standard into accepting states that are taken hostage at gunpoint? Will this become a standard in the EU that whenever a militant group takes out another existing government or systems of governance, it will lead to something that's going to be accepted by the EU? I don't think that's likely to be the case, because the only reason on why that's going to be the case within terms of why that's not even going to be the case within terms of legitimization. We sanction states all the time, nor we take out sanctions. That doesn't make them sort of legitimate or illegitimate at the end of the day. But we have to note in this instance, this is the only way to do so. There is no other alternative, because the Taliban regime is unlikely to listen to you at the end of the day. Why is the Taliban unlikely to listen to you? They will see you, not only you seeing them as an unreasonable actor, but the cons also applies. They will see you as an unreasonable actor. So when the time comes when in terms of negotiations that you ask for things such as like the improvements of human rights, the reopening of schools, and etc., they are unlikely to listen to you, because they don't see you as someone that they should listen to, because they see you as someone that collects their rent and that collects their taxes and that ultimately just makes life worse off for their people. I think it was marginally tackled on within terms of Kyra's speech that bulk of the reason on why things such as like utility and necessities aren't met within terms of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan right now is due to the heavy sanctions that exist, which means the reason on why life is hard for people in Afghanistan is the very reason of the sanctions that come from the EU, which deals with the fact that life gets only worse when sanctions are in place, which means that sanctions do not work and will continue to make things worse on their side of the house, which they have to marginally defend. The second thing I'm going to respond to is something really quickly. I'm just going to respond to the whole fact, will this anger the EU at the end of the day? One, in technical sense, the motion assumes and presumes that when making this decision, the EU has already come to a consensus vote that this is what they will ultimately do. Secondly, will this ultimately anger the EU when we already constantly talk to you about how this affects their migration crisis directly, that how it takes out billions and billions upon funding because of migrants moving in towards the EU due to the Taliban regime worsening condition. But thirdly, we also talked to you on how this isn't going to be legitimate. This isn't something that's going to lead towards legitimacy at the end of the day. And even if it does lead towards legitimacy, we think that's only going to make the Taliban more likely to listen to you and listen to your deals, because now they have to be beholden towards other accountable bodies in order to have those trade deals exist. Because we have to note the main characterization here that was thrusted to you in terms of Kyra's first speech was the very idea that when you sanction them more and you turn their backs on the wall, is when they do more illegal activities, because it is out of necessity. That's where they're likely to get their funding within terms of like those hostage takings and etc. Two, that's how they're likely to get things done within terms of like keeping control of their people, because they're forced. Their backs are forced on the wall, so they have to hold these people at gunpoint because they don't have the means and necessity in order to give the needs for these people at the end of the day. We have to note they cannot just come in here and posit that sanctions will make it easier for the EU to negotiate with the Taliban. If the main tipping point of the debate is just simply talking about negotiations, we are likely to have it better off on our side, which will lead to my substantive. First of all, sanctions are unlikely to work, aside from the plethora of reasons that I've given to you, because sanctions have historically been proven not to work, given that those imposed by the US on Iran have only strained relationships with both nations and have not resulted in significant change, and have only entrenched the citizens on the ground into poverty and generally making the country poorer by the years. Secondly, the thing that the Taliban wants are inherent towards their religion and inherent towards their region as well, but in terms of improving it and improving like things like Sharia. The next thing that you have to note from the first characterization is that when you ultimately place more and more sanctions, which is something that they want to do on their side of the house, they are unlikely to listen, because the main tipping point and the main argumentation and the main case of first negative was to say that the Taliban is likely to listen to you when you post sanctions on them because you have a bargaining chip. One, they do not see it as a bargaining chip, nor do they see it as something that you hold over them. Rather, they see it as a provocative attack, which is what leads towards the harms that happen in terms of society, which flips their entire argumentation that sanctions are the way to hold them gunpoint. That's exactly the fact. You hold them gunpoint, so they see it as an act of aggression rather as an act of negotiation, which means you're unlikely to get any benefits within terms of side negative, which means they have to defend a world where in terms of like they have to defend a world where in terms that nothing is going to change, but rather what is the only, if there is something that's going to change, it's that the relationship between the EU and as well as the Taliban within terms of making deals are going to be strained to the point that they are unwilling to even negotiate. We think that sanctions are ineffective today, and it will continually get worse for the EU as a whole, and it's unlikely to change anything because it's due to the constant sanctioning, which is what leads to the harsh conditions that happen in Afghanistan, which leads to not everyone getting their basic necessities and as well as necessities, which forces them to flee at the end of the day, which also leads to people migrating into the EU, which costs the EU billions. We have to note that migrating one immigrant fully costs a lot. You need to constantly spend on food, clothes, shelter, and pay for the security that protects them, which costs a lot of money. We have to note that to ultimately change the Taliban's ideals, we also have to consider the things that we can negotiate on and the things that are uncompromisable on, things such as human rights and rights for women are likely to be better on our side, because the trend shows when we do become more amicable and we do give them something, we think that they're likely to listen. But even if it does lead to legitimization of the Taliban, why is that something that we are likely to be okay with? One, there is no other alternative but to recognize this as a legitimate government at this point in time within terms of the EU and in terms of the debate. Because one, America is unlikely to help and free Afghanistan as a whole. There's unlikely to be callbacks to go back to Afghanistan, given that US just made a scene that they wanted to pull out. The EU is unlikely to spend money to send people down there because to spend money to send people down there is likely to cost billions and upon billions. So the only way to lessen the deals that happen within terms of the EU and improve the relationship with the Taliban is to lessen the sanctions. They have to prove we can do everything that they can do, but they can never lessen those sanctions. With all those reasons and more, clearly affirm.
I think the second affirmative, second negative.
I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Okay, I'm just gonna set up my timer. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two very simple things in my speech. One, why is lifting of sanctions not likely going to work, and why sanctions in the long run is the way to go ahead with it? The reason these are the two questions is simply because we identify from both sides the end to be the same. That is betterment of the people of Afghanistan in the long run, and also like more geopolitical peace and prosperity within the region that Afghanistan like exists in. To that extent, like I'll have two like broad arguments, but I want to do one response targeted towards what DPM says. I think there's a claim here, that is to say that sanctions haven't necessarily worked and they don't like really work. And they give the example of Iran. I think a bad example in and of itself. Firstly, I want to say sanctions do work. Sure, they don't mean that you just topple governments and remove them from power, but there are concessions you're able to get, the point at which you can economically like pressure these countries to make some concessions in the very first place. In the absence of sanctions, what mechanism exists for this to happen is something that's unknown, and simply lifting of sanctions, meaning that like Afghanistan is likely going to reciprocate, is something that's extremely unlikely and needed to be analytically proved on side affirmative. But secondly, I think literally we got Iran to sign the non-proliferation treaty as a consequence of these sanctions, which means that we can even put strong governments into like a lock and then like make them negotiate deals the way we necessarily want them to. But what's more crucial to recognize is, unlike Iran, when they inherited the power, at the very least, they like Afghanistan has a much weaker economy, but also a much more unstable like political system in the very first place, which means sanctions as like a means that works has a lot more higher propensity within the case of Afghanistan. I think this is one clarification I wanted to make, and the saying sanctions doesn't work is really unnuanced and dismissive of the nature in which geopolitics works. So two things in my speech. Firstly, why is this not going to work? And I'm going to directly deal with the two like broad arguments we get from side affirmative. One, where they say this is best in the interest of EU because issues can be caused by increased immigration. And secondly, they say that the brunt of these sanctions fall on the people of Afghanistan and therefore hurts the most vulnerable people. With the first idea, one, like about about like increased sanctions leading to increased immigration. I think this does not simply change by lifting sanctions, and this is important to understand. People flee countries for general threat to their life, and so long as Taliban remains, I think this threat exists whether they are sanctioned or not. Because firstly, you have gender minorities that probably still feel like literally unsafe, but also like people with different sexual orientation, which is not heteronormative, also are at the same point like under threat. But also remember, there are people who remember what the previous Taliban regime was like, which is why there is massive distrust within the place in the very first place. Which is why I think like people moving out is not something that's contingent on sanctions, but it's contingent on whether Taliban remains in power or not. And if it does so, I think immigration as an issue continues on side affirmative as well. Secondly, if you lift sanctions, the kind of mobility that comes about leads to a lot more immigration, because now people are open to migrate out from Afghanistan a lot more easily, simply because you don't put these sanctions. So if the claim is that there's more immigration, which might lead to more issues that on-site affirmative, notice it is lifting of sanctions that incentivizes more immigration in the very first place, or at the very least, the problem remains consistently the same because Taliban is in power. So if I can show to you that the situation worsens if you lift sanctions, then we win on the clash identified by the affirmative itself. Secondly, they say the brunt of these sanctions fall on the people of Afghanistan and hurts the most vulnerable people. I want to say a few things to this. One, if it is about helping the people of Afghanistan, I think you have massive aid directly coming from both US and EU. And this is important because this direct aid isn't something that goes through channels of Taliban, but it is directly given to the people of Afghanistan. I'm willing to concede that this might not be enough, but this is still an avenue that exists to ensure that the ground level reality of Afghanistan is not as bad as it exists, which means that lifting sanctions isn't the only way to ensure that people on the ground level are better. We think aid as a means is something that continuously exists. But secondly, I think the idea that the brunt falls on might be true to a great extent, but lifting sanctions doesn't mean more money in general, because Taliban continues to be in control of various, firstly, supply chains, and secondly, financial channels within the nations, which means like, and this is what affirmative had to tell us, why is it likely that an unreliable actor like Taliban is probably going to use this money and these fundings specifically with the idea of helping the people? If they say that this is what the Taliban has said, the Taliban has also said that they're going to give women rights, but have continued segregated education since their inception last year. This means that like, even if you're able to create channels of money, given that the like Taliban continues to be in power, these channels and these outlets are likely going to be controlled by them and probably going to be used in furtherance of the agenda that Taliban has in the very first place. But this is where we clash with Affirmative. We don't think that lifting these sanctions immediately brings about changes of functioning of Taliban. And here's why. And there's like also plausible reasons as to why this will not lead to a good scenario. One, assuming that you're able to get concessions, and I'm hoping you lift these sanctions at least because you give women rights, minority rights, I think this is also not likely going to be the stable. Notice that Affirmative only says that Taliban will listen to you if you give and take something. I think this disregards the structural reasons as to why that's not going to be the case. For that, I have three. One, Taliban is are the conservative champions of the nation and need to continue pushing this to continue the support that it has with its followers, which means women and gender minority rights are likely never going to be prioritized within the politics, or is often going to be so radical that there's no semblance with like rights to begin with. Secondly, there is internal political conflict within the Taliban, with the current leadership pushing for moderate government while the traditional stronghold continues to push for a more radical conservative one. So even if you're able to strike some sort of a deal as EU with a Talibani leader, this might as well change in the future because the domestic politics of Taliban is that unstable and can change. Thirdly, once you lift sanctions and like presumably as EU say start trading with Taliban or giving them like finances, it becomes increasingly difficult to reinstall them once you've established trade relationships. So if Affirmative were to claim that if they backtrack on these deals, we'll place sanctions on these people once more, I think the cost of doing that would be a lot higher. But more importantly, notice that this allows for Taliban to have the runway to overturn perception and support. Assuming that Affirmative is right, if Taliban is able to weather through this phase and is able to somewhat stabilize the economy, they're likely going to use it to further their own agenda. Because the priority of Taliban is to create a strong central power within Afghanistan right now, more so than anything. This means if you lift sanctions, you allow Taliban to increase its military and political might. This has two impacts. One, Taliban is firstly much more capable now to carry out human rights atrocities. And secondly, Taliban may be able to turn the popular opinion of the people in its favor using conservative propaganda. And I think if you lift the sanctions, they have enough time and resources to do so. Why is sanction likely going to work? Three reasons. One, the Taliban is firstly economically crippled. Secondly, a weaker government means that they're likely going to face resistance and fall against rebel groups. And thirdly, at the very least, I think if we use sanctions, we're able to bully Taliban into giving some concessions. What mechanism exists on Affirmative is something that's not true. So let's weigh this. One, vulnerable people. I think it's one thing to say that we need to help Taliban Afghanistanis, but it's also important to realize the real vulnerable people are probably gender minorities and anti-Talibani dissidents who are at risk when Taliban is much more powerful when you lift the sanctions. But secondly, if the idea on like Affirmative is that they want to help the people who are already getting aid, they need to reconcile with the fact that if you help the government, the risk is much more when it comes to people who are already in minority and already at risk. I think this is the trade-off that they needed to deal with. And it's not just a haphazard de-escalation of like issues over there. Extremely proud to oppose.
I thank the second negative and welcome the third affirmative.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Can we stop the recording if it's fine?
One. Let's go. Panel, what the interests of the EU are in this debate? I'll go clash by clash and tell you why necessarily negative wins this particular debate. Firstly, the refugee crisis, which Affirmative talks about. Affirmative says the refugee crisis will necessarily get worse with sanctions and will somehow ameliorate when we roll back sanctions because individuals have no incentive to leave Afghanistan. However, this is just an assertion to the extent that they're unable to prove to you how any of these benefits actually trickle down to the ground when they themselves concede that the Taliban government is selfish and also an unreliable actor in first and second speech, respectively. I think conclusively on OP, we give you significantly more material as to why the refugee crisis is likely to be symmetric to the extent that Afghanistan will continue attacking minorities and is like still an ideological actor and likely to continue to attack these individuals in the first place, something I don't think that Affirmative can say, oh, they won't do it. But number two, we also posit to you that it's likely to get worse. The point in time the Taliban government has more money to crack down even harder and more civilians are forced to flee the region. And also furthermore, other incentives for individual leave, such as the memory of previous Taliban rule, and how the fact of the matter is that they are very, very scared of the Taliban government. That's precisely why individuals are leaving in the first place. So allowing for the Taliban government to strengthen its stronghold in Afghanistan is in the worst case likely to inflate the refugee crisis to heights we've never seen before. Also, like mitigated responses in the fact of how locked borders near Afghanistan, etc., already mean that the refugee crisis is not as bad as it used to, and the sanctions in place necessarily ensure that the Taliban has less ability to crack down on civilians, ensuring less refugee crisis in the first place. So we think we take the refugee crisis clash as well. Secondly, in terms of sanctions, I think firstly, the massive assumption on affirmative is that they say Taliban will moderate itself. However, A, no mechanism for this, B, no incentive for this, to the extent that they've already rolled back sanctions, so they have no like incentive to moderate themselves. But also this is something that is incredibly unlikely to the extent that Taliban is an ideological actor that is beholden to extremely conservative values and is something that and conservative extremist values and is unlikely to moderate itself because that's literally on the ideological basis on which they got elected. Sure, they may say we're going to be nice now, but they still slaughtered several civilians and human rights activists. So I don't think they can rely on Taliban's promises. But I also think the point in time you negate your only bargaining chip, I'm unsure as to how negotiations happen in their world, and something affirmative needed to prove to you as to how we are going to negotiate any sort of like concessions that the Taliban will give out. Versus in our world, where in our best case, we bully them into weakening all the crackdown on the civilians and like we bleed them out by running their resources dry, which may either weakens them enough to fall, or in at least the worst case, where sanctions, in our worst case, reduces their ability to crack down on their civilians, thus in at least protecting civilians on the ground in Afghanistan and ensuring that the European Union at least has some credibility internationally as a human rights actor and also within the EU as well, right? So I think sanctions and their effectiveness also falls to negative. I think, thirdly, in terms of the material that we give to you, in terms of the implications for the EU geopolitically and the optics of this move, I think, in terms of geopolitically, the fact that other armed groups in areas in which the EU has interests and several allies across the world necessarily means that these armed groups are likely to be emboldened. They just say they want to be emboldened without any sort of like analysis. But we also think that the countries in which these conflicts occur, who are European Union allies, are likely to be massively disrupted due to like more internal conflicts springing up. And the fact of the matter is that our trade with the European Union is decreased. The European Union is seen as a less helpful ally and also seen as somebody that like endorses like like for the best part, like terrorist group. But also destabilize the entirety of the region, countries like India and the entirety of the Middle East and North Africa, which trade with massive trade partners with the European Union. But also internally weakens the EU. The point in time, not only the right, but the conservative parts of the EU, but also the liberal parts of the EU are in favor of sanctions and the Taliban. They needed to engage with all of this material and also win the first two clash in order to take this debate. On those metrics, panel, negate.
I think the negative reply, affirmative reply, please.
Hello. Am I visible and audible at the same time?
You're just audible.
Oh, what about now? I just turned the camera on. I'm sorry.
You're both now.
Okay.
Great.
Just want to check if there's any lag or anything.
No, you're good.
Okay, great. Okay, just before I begin my speech, I just want to do a quick shout out to my friends, Jay, Tita, and Marga, who's actually staying with me in this Airbnb. And of course, my friend, Hans Wong, who is watching also in the other room. So yeah, shout out to them. Anyway, and as well as I think, yeah, just that. Anyway, I'll be beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, at this point in time, I am quite unsure of what the case of side negative is. Because if they spend a bulk of their time, no, their entire time at first and second negative, that the Taliban is willing to negotiate with them through sanctions, through the bullying that they give to them that weakens them substantially. Imagine my surprise when third negative comes up and says that the Taliban is anti-West and they will be unwilling to negotiate with you because they are anti-West. Then if that was the case, how are they likely to get their benefits? Because if the Taliban is inherently anti-West, they will be also unwilling to negotiate to you, even if you bully them. But never mind how we already told to you, the main reason why the Taliban is currently anti-West is because of this quote-unquote bullying, which they see as an act of aggression, which is why they are unwilling to help you. The next thing that they point out is this sanctions will substantially weaken them without even giving us any grounding or any instances or even an actor analysis that that's likely to be the case or any incentive structures. No, this is what pushes them to commit more crimes. Never mind that was clear from Kyra's speech, the reasoning on why people don't get enough water and food, why people move out of the country, which is why the Taliban commits more atrocities, is because they have to now that they are heavily burdened with sanctions. Never mind, my entire speech was more about how these sanctions are what's straining the relationship between the EU right now and the Taliban. And never mind that the conclusion to that argument was to say that it will strain it even further. All they say is that they will bully and curb without even giving to us any tangible results that has happened through the bullying and curbing that has been happening through 20 years at the end of the day. Meaning, even on their best case, it is a contention and it is also a concession on their side that they are also unable to get help if we are to operate in their frame that the Taliban is anti-West. Panel, there is a huge burden that Negative has to prove here because they took it upon themselves to prove that sanctions will be the one to topple the Taliban or to make deals with them. So imagine again my surprise when second Negative comes up here and say that they will also give aid to these people. Clearly, this is a team that's full of surprises because they can't agree on their own characterization. Never mind that this is a contention to their case, but rather look at it as a concession that they also had to do, that in order to actually negotiate with the Taliban, that we need to give them an olive branch when second Negative comes up and says, we will both give sanctions and aid at the same time. Then they paraphrase that you're saying that's how Doctors Without Borders work. I don't think Doctors Without Borders is currently sanctioning the Taliban. I don't also think that's going to logically work speaking. Because if you are a country that's sanctioning them, if you are a European Union that's sanctioning them, they will be skeptic of the help that you send them, and that's likely to lead to your people getting killed at the end of the day. In order for other groups to work, is because they are helping and they aren't harming the Taliban. Bullying the Taliban has done nothing but strain the relationship. We've already told to you, sure, we do agree that the Afghanistan deserve a better ruler than the Taliban regime, but they have no other alternative right now, nor do they have any other hopes of getting an alternative in the future because the current trends look to the trends of just simply having countries deal with their own problems first because it's not something that's central to them. It's not central to them. The main point that you have to talk about on our speech is the huge straw man that comes out of their entire team, right? Because our case wasn't just simply about the immigration crisis. It's about the centrality of the interest of the EU. It is true the EU wants to help in terms of giving human rights, but the only way to give human rights to these people right now is to, at the worst case, see them as legitimate because there is no other way to do so. It's also to lessen the immigration. But if we are unlikely to get to lessen the immigration, we are likely to get better relationships with them because we are no longer straining them, nor are we giving them any acts of aggression. Never did they respond that sanctioning isn't something that's isn't seen as an act of aggression, which is why they will never be willing to listen to them on their side of the house. Clearly, affirm.
I think the affirmative reply and welcome everyone to leave